He screamed only once, piercing through the walls of Richmond Palace like a warning bell, one shrill, raw cry that sent chills down the spines of those who heard it. The nurses said it wasn't the cry of a newborn, but something deeper. Something old. Then he went silent. For several agonizing seconds, no one breathed. Even the wind outside the nursery window seemed to stop. Then slowly a faint, wheezing breath followed. The midwives crossed themselves. The boy was alive. But from the moment he entered the world, something felt terribly wrong. On the surface, it was a moment of joy. England erupted in celebration. On the first day of 1511, after years of tragic miscarriages and stillbirths, King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon finally welcomed their long-awaited heir, Henry, Duke of Cornwall. He was robust, the court was told. Strong lungs, healthy color, a prince to continue the Tudor line, a savior for a dynasty still haunted by the blood-soaked rise of Henry VII. Bonfires were lit across London. Bells rang for days. Wine flowed freely in the streets. It was the single greatest birth in England's young century. But inside the palace, unease festered beneath the gilded smiles. There had been complications. The Queen had labored for nearly 2 full days, and witnesses spoke of strange occurrences in the birthing chamber of a candelabra, crashing to the floor without cause of the Queen, mumbling in her native Spanish while staring at the wall of the child's skin appearing blue for the first hour before warming. All chalked up to exhaustion. Nerves, superstition. The christening was a grand, ostentatious affair. It took place just 3 days later, as if the court feared the baby would vanish if they waited. He was baptized in the chapel of the observant friars with water from the river Jordan, and his cradle was draped in cloth of gold. Trumpets blared. Dignitaries bowed, and as the archbishop anointed the child's head, Queen Catherine wept tears that trembled between joy and dread. She had buried too many children already, and this time she had dared to hope. There were signs if one cared to notice. Just before the child's birth, a comet streaked across the English sky, brilliant, long-tailed, and crimson. In the superstitions of the age, comets were omens of death and catastrophe. A few nights later, a fire broke out in a tavern not far from Westminster, burning half the building to the ground. A maid claimed she found a dead crow nailed to the nursery door the morning after the birth, though she was swiftly dismissed and never seen again. These were all dismissed as unfortunate coincidences, but in Tudor England, nothing was just coincidence. Preparations for the future unfolded rapidly. The baby was given lands titles and a future that extended far beyond the cradle. Envoys from Spain and the Holy Roman Empire came with gifts. The Pope sent a blessing. It was all falling into place. Henry VIII boasted that his son would one day lead armies into France, would be crowned Emperor of Christendom. The people believed him. After all, the child was strong. He was the Tudor miracle. But the Queen was still bleeding and her body refused to heal. The midwives urged caution prayer. Catherine locked herself in her chambers for long hours, gripping her rosary until her fingers bled. The king visited his son only once in those first weeks, reportedly finding the baby too quiet. But he brushed it off. "A good calm lad," he said. "He'll roar soon enough." The court marveled at how well-behaved the child seemed. He rarely cried, slept through nights. Nurses praised his stillness, his silence, his serenity. But in the shadows of the palace, that silence began to frighten them. Then, sometime in late February, the boy developed a fever. It came suddenly, no warning, no build-up. One nurse found him flushed and slick with sweat. Another noticed he had begun to arch his back in his sleep, fist-clenched eyes rolling back into his skull. He didn't cry. He couldn't. His body trembled like a branch in a storm, but no sound came. The royal physicians were summoned immediately, but they arrived late into the night, drunk from the feasting. The Queen was informed. She collapsed at the threshold of the nursery. The baby was moved to a separate chamber, sealed and guarded. Only the most trusted attendants were allowed in. The air around the palace turned cold, not in weather but in spirit. The feast stopped. The music quieted. The bells fell silent. No one dared say it aloud, but everyone felt it. Something was coming. Something had already begun. They tried everything: leeches, herbal poultices, prayers whispered over the crib. One friar even attempted an exorcism in secret, but the baby remained still, barely breathing, his tiny chest rising and falling like a ghost caught between worlds. In public, the king smiled. In private, he raged, tore tapestries, shattered goblets. He began to speak of sin, of divine judgment, of how God might be punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. He began to avoid the queen. At night, maids reported hearing strange noises from the sealed room, scratching, moaning, and once a low, gurgling laugh. The sounds were dismissed as imagination nerves, but the door was kept locked from the outside. And then the coughing began, wet, gurgling, like drowning in blood. The child was dying, and no one knew why. The baby's breathing became erratic. Some nights he would lie perfectly still for hours, so motionless the nurses feared he was already gone, only to jolt awake with a shuddering gasp, his tiny limbs stiffening, his eyes wide with terror. He didn't scream. He couldn't. Whatever force had taken hold of him had stolen even that. The silence, more than the illness itself, began to unnerve everyone. Eyewitnesses would later describe the child's fits in detail, his back arching unnaturally, as though an invisible hand were wrenching him upward, his jaw clenching shut so tightly that blood trickled from his gums. The royal midwife, a woman who had delivered dozens of noble children across 3 decades, was seen trembling after one such episode. She reportedly whispered to a chambermaid, "I've never seen a child seize like that and live." And I don't think he should have. By now the fever had taken root. His skin fluctuated between burning hot and icy cold. Boils began to form along his scalp, some of which ruptured in the night. One nurse attempting to change the baby's linens recoiled when she found blood pooled in the folds of his neck. The smell was described as wrong, not just foul, but unnatural. Like rot. Like death before death. The royal physicians were utterly baffled. They prescribed purges, powders, potions of honey and vinegar. Nothing helped. The infant's body was deteriorating in real time. A chronicler of the court years later wrote that it was as though the prince were cursed in his very blood, that he carried damnation within his veins, from the moment of his christening. The terrifying truth was that no one, not even the finest minds in the kingdom, could explain what was happening. And the less they understood, the more the fear grew. Servants began refusing nursery duty. Some claimed they saw shadows moving across the crib at night. Others swore the baby's eyes glowed faintly in the dark. The king dismissed these stories as panic and superstition, but he too stopped visiting the nursery. His face was tight with fear, his eyes sunken and distant. In one reported incident, he awoke screaming from a nightmare and demanded all mirrors be removed from his bedchamber. When asked why, he reportedly said, "I saw him." The boy. He opened his mouth and fire poured out. Catherine, meanwhile, was unraveling. She spent her nights on the cold stone floor of the palace chapel praying aloud until her voice cracked and her fingers bled. Her faith, once a source of strength, had become an obsession. She believed the child's suffering was a punishment from God, not just for her sins, but for the entire nation. She begged the priests to baptize him again. When they refused, she began lighting candles in a specific pattern each night, a ritualistic act that many found disturbing. She no longer smiled. She barely spoke. The Queen of England had become a ghost in her own palace. As the baby's condition worsened, the room itself began to change. The once lavish nursery, draped in silk and golden thread, took on the aura of a death chamber. The curtains were kept drawn at all hours. The hearth was never lit. Candles burned constantly, but somehow never bright enough. Visitors reported feeling dizzy upon entering, as if the air were thick with smoke or sorrow. One bishop who was summoned to bless the child fell unconscious mid-prayer, and later claimed to have seen a dark figure hovering above the crib. Then came the bleeding. It began with the nose, a slow, steady drip that stained the blankets crimson. Then the ears. Then horrifically the mouth. The child would seize, then go limp, and red foam would begin to bubble from his lips. The attending nurse reportedly screamed and dropped him the first time it happened. She was dismissed within the hour, but not before whispering to another, That is no longer a child. That's a message. On the 5th night of bleeding, the decision was made. The child was to be prepared for death. They swaddled him in a fresh white shroud, lit candles around the room, and summoned a priest. The second anointing reserved for the dying was performed in whispers. His body was so small, his veins so fragile, that even the holy oil seemed too heavy upon him. The priest hesitated while anointing the head. "He feels cold," he said, but still watching. And then, as if summoned by that final blessing, the child convulsed violently his limbs, thrashing his head, thrown back in a silent scream. Blood gushed from his nose, his ears, his mouth all at once. His eyes rolled back until only white remained. The priest dropped the crucifix. The midwife fainted. The only sound in the room was a horrible choking rattle, the death rattle from a throat too small to bear it. And just like that, it stopped. His body collapsed lifeless and twisted into the crook of the nurse's arms. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was oppressive, as though something had left the room, or worse, entered it. There was no wailing, no cries from the queen, no royal pronouncement, just a quiet sealing of the chamber door. The death of Henry, Duke of Cornwall, at just 52 days old, was never officially explained. The king issued a short, vague announcement citing natural causes. But no one believed it. Something had taken that child. And whatever it was, it had left a scar on the throne. The child's body was prepared in complete silence. No music played. No ceremonial drums sounded. The women assigned to dress the corpse refused to touch it at first, claiming its skin had turned a waxy, translucent color, and felt too cold for the living, too soft for the dead. A maid who tried to comb what little hair the child had left reportedly screamed that it came off in her hands. The coffin was ordered to be small, barely 3 feet long, and covered in white silk. It was carried through the palace halls at night by torchlight so the public would not see. There had been plans for a grand procession, a royal burial fit for a Tudor prince. But the plans changed. The route was shortened. The banners were removed. The streets were never lined with mourners. The official line was mourning, but everyone in court whispered the same thing: fear. Fear that to honor the child too loudly would draw the same curse upon them, that something had marked the boy and anyone who touched him might carry the mark too. Even Henry VIII, the proud, boastful king, the man who once said he would build an empire for his son, refused to attend the burial. Instead, he locked himself inside his private chamber and emerged only days later, pale and withdrawn. Those who saw him said his eyes had changed. He paced constantly. He muttered scripture under his breath. At night, he screamed in his sleep. Some claimed he ordered his servants to sleep outside his room with swords drawn, in case it comes back. He said, though, he never clarified what it was. Catherine, meanwhile, had to be carried to her bed. She refused food. She refused prayer. She stared at the ceiling for hours, unblinking. Her ladies-in-waiting took turns staying with her around the clock, afraid to leave her alone. One of them wrote in a letter to a relative in Spain, "Our good queen has gone into the land of shadows. She speaks to God as if he were in the room, and sometimes to the child too." The funeral itself was a grotesque performance of restraint. The tiny coffin was set upon a bier in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by clergy too afraid to look directly at it. The incense choked the air. The priests dressed in their finest robes stumbled over the liturgy. The words "eternal peace" seemed to catch in their throats. No music, no choir, only the clinking of candle holders as the flame trembled in the dark. A child not even 2 months old was buried with the rites of a king, but none of the majesty. It was a burial done out of obligation, not love. And still something lingered. Witnesses swore the candles surrounding the coffin wouldn't stay lit. One by one they sputtered out first, 2, then 3 more, then all. When the last one died, the abbey was plunged into darkness, and a priest dropped to his knees sobbing. Later, one attendant claimed he heard scratching from inside the coffin. Another denied it. He heard whispering. A dog belonging to one of the palace guards went missing the next day, last seen sniffing near the tomb. The guard said the animal ran off with its tail tucked between its legs, whining like it had been struck. It was never found. The king would not speak of the funeral again. But the guilt was overwhelming. Not just sorrow or grief guilt. Henry began blaming himself, though never publicly. In private, he questioned whether his marriage to Catherine had defied God's law. After all, she had been married to his brother Arthur. Was it true what the old priest had said? That a man who lies with his brother's wife will be childless. Was this the curse of Leviticus? He began avoiding the queen. His letters to her, once affectionate and warm, became curt and formal. He stopped referring to her as my beloved and began addressing her by title alone. Her touch seemed to repel him. Her voice grated like a distant memory. Whatever love remained between them was now chained to a grave. The queen, equally tormented, sank deeper into her faith. She ordered masses for the soul of the child every week at her own expense. She refused to sleep in the same room where the child had been conceived, and in her own personal chapel she had a painting commissioned of the Madonna, holding the lifeless body of Christ, but in the child's face, the painter had unmistakably captured the features of the late Duke of Cornwall. It was so disturbing that many palace visitors refused to look at it. Some even claimed the child's ghost haunted the palace. Servants would later whisper of hearing soft whimpers echoing down the empty nursery hall at night. A few said they saw the shape of a swaddled infant lying in the crib long after it had been removed. And once a new maid was reportedly found, standing over the empty cradle humming a lullaby to thin air. No explanation was ever offered. The nursery itself was sealed. No one dared enter. The windows were boarded from the outside. The room was left untouched, blankets, still folded toys still in place, as if waiting for their owner to return. When it was finally opened years later during renovations, workers claimed the room smelled of iron and decay. The cradle, untouched for a decade, had mold along its edges and a dark stain that no one could explain. The people of England mourned, but cautiously. Public sermons urged prayer, but not grief. Something had broken and everyone felt it. Some called it tragedy. Others whispered it was a judgment. But no one, not even the king, could deny what had happened that February. A child had died, and with him the hope of a kingdom. For months the court kept silent. But silence is never still in a palace like Henry's. It breathes, it festers, and soon it whispers. The official explanation for the prince's death was vague and unsatisfying. A sudden illness, they said. But England in 1511 was no stranger to sickness. Children died all the time. Still no one, not the common folk, not the courtiers, not even the foreign ambassadors, believed it had been ordinary. Not this time, not this child. Whispers began to swirl. Poison, witchcraft, a divine curse. Something had reached into the cradle of England's future and snuffed it out like a candle, and the people needed to believe it was more than nature. They needed a culprit. The first fingers pointed at the Queen's Spanish heritage. Catherine of Aragon was beloved but foreign. Her Spanish midwives, her unusual religious customs, her preference for confession in the old tongue, it all seemed suspect now. Some even whispered that her womb had been cursed by Moorish blood, a punishment passed down from the Reconquista. Absurd, but fear makes monsters from shadows. Then came the darker rumors. A courtier close to the Queen was quietly dismissed, no reason given. He had been seen near the nursery in the days before the prince's decline. A scullery maid later claimed he had brought an unmarked vial to the child's wet nurse. She told her story to a priest who told no one until his body was found floating in the Thames, his mouth stuffed with straw. That last detail was never made public, but someone wrote it down. Royal midwives were questioned. Some disappeared afterward. The head nurse, Matilda Vance, was said to have screamed during interrogation that the child had no shadow and then bit through her own tongue before she could be asked what she meant. She was found dead in her cell the next morning. Suicide, they said, but the mark on her wrist looked like a burn, not a rope. The king ordered silence, but it was too late. Fear had taken root in the palace gardens, winding itself around every stone column and whispering down every corridor. People began to suspect each other. A silver goblet was found in the Queen's chamber with dried black residue at the bottom. No one claimed it. A physician fled the country and was arrested in Calais when questioned. He said only, "I was told to be gone before the full moon, or I would be next." And then there was the matter of the timing. It wasn't just that the baby died, it was when he died. Just weeks after his birth, a political envoy from the Holy Roman Empire had arrived with troubling news. The balance of Catholic power in Europe was shifting. Spain and England needed a male heir to anchor their alliance, or the Habsburgs might turn to France. The death of the boy destabilized everything. Some whispered that certain parties wanted the child gone. A weak England was easier to manipulate. Could someone in court have poisoned the child to push England into crisis? Some pointed to Wolsey still clawing his way up the ranks. Others blamed the French, who were rumored to have spies even within the chapel. A few even suggested that the Boleyn family, barely on the fringes of power at this point, had foreseen a path to influence if Catherine fell from favor. It was nonsense, wasn't it? And yet the symptoms didn't fit any known illness. Convulsions, bleeding black bile, blistering of the skin. The child had not merely died, he had deteriorated, decayed. Not over weeks, but days, hours. Modern historians have offered theories: sudden infant death syndrome, hemophilia, a rare bacterial infection. But these explanations feel clinical cold. They don't account for the fear that seized the palace. They don't explain why the cradle was burned, or why months later the queen's most trusted priest was found dead with pages torn from the Book of Job stuffed down his throat. Some things people said should not be spoken of. Some things were not for men to explain. And so, in desperation, the court turned not to medicine or law, but to rituals. A secret blessing was conducted at the site of the prince's burial. Soil from a monastery in Canterbury was spread beneath the altar. The archbishop himself led the rite, but no one would speak of what was said. All that is known is that, after the ceremony, he resigned from court and retreated to a remote priory where he lived in silence until his death. The king's faith had begun to rot. He no longer looked to God for comfort, but for reasons. Punishment, justice, or vengeance. Henry started reading the Old Testament obsessively, especially Leviticus. One verse in particular began to haunt him. "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." He repeated it often. To his advisors, to himself, to the mirror. Was this what had happened? Had he brought a curse upon England by marrying his brother's widow? Had God taken the child in wrath? The answer he clung to in the dark was yes. And from that answer came the seeds of destruction. Because if the queen's womb was cursed, then it would have to be replaced, and the world would burn for it. Henry VIII had never known true helplessness until the night his son died. In war, he could swing a sword. In court, he could crush dissent with a look. But in that nursery, standing over the twisted, bloodied body of the child who bore his name, the most powerful man in England had been rendered utterly powerless. And it shattered something inside him. He began to descend slowly at first, like a man slipping into cold water. But soon the descent became a spiral. He stopped trusting those around him. He questioned his advisors' loyalty. He interrogated his own physicians. He even ordered his food tasted 3 times before eating. He spoke less in council and more in riddles. One foreign ambassador reported back to his king, "The English sovereign speaks often of fire and blood and the mouths of serpents. He is not as he was." Henry's guilt was a living thing. He wore it like armor beneath his robes. His dreams turned violent, bloody visions of a child swaddled in white, rising from a grave, reaching out with fingers blackened by rot. He stopped sleeping altogether. A priest summoned to calm him was dismissed after Henry accused him of whispering to the dead. The palace became quieter, colder. Servants reported seeing the king walking the halls at night alone, muttering to portraits. Once he was seen cradling a child's toy in the royal chapel, a carved wooden lamb once given to the Duke of Cornwall as a christening gift. When a guard approached, Henry turned on him with a snarl and ordered him beaten for spying on a father's grief. But grief was not the only thing twisting Henry's mind. There was something else, something darker. He became obsessed with biblical law, poring over Hebrew scriptures with court theologians. Leviticus 20:21, "They shall be childless," became his refrain. He quoted it at dinner. He whispered it during audiences. He etched it into the wood of his writing desk. He began to believe fully and fatally that God was punishing him, not only for marrying Catherine, but for daring to defy divine order. The idea burrowed into him like a worm. Catherine had once been wed to his brother Arthur. The marriage had supposedly never been consummated, but what if it had? What if their union truly was an abomination? This was no longer paranoia, it was revelation. He started meeting with mystics and astrologers in secret. Men who read the stars and entrails. Women who claimed to speak with angels or worse. One such woman, a prophetess from the north, reportedly told Henry, "Your line is cursed until the Spanish rose withers." She was arrested days later and vanished from the tower without trial. Desperate, Henry began to distance himself from Catherine. He stopped visiting her chambers. Their conversations became strained, stilted. He began accusing her of hiding truths from him about Arthur, about her pregnancies, about the child. She denied everything, but denial no longer mattered. He had decided. He began avoiding their daughter Mary as well. Though she was only a toddler, he looked upon her with suspicion. Was she tainted too? Had the curse passed to her once during a private dinner? Mary reached for his hand and Henry reportedly recoiled as if burned. From that night forward, he rarely spoke to her. It was not enough to believe Catherine was cursed. He needed something to cleanse the stain from his soul. Someone untainted, a new beginning, a new womb, a new queen. And just as these thoughts began to crystallize into resolve, Anne Boleyn appeared. She had always been in the periphery, sharp-eyed, intelligent, striking in a way that was not soft, but cutting. Unlike her sister Mary, Anne did not seek Henry's affection with submissive smiles. She resisted, teased, denied. And Henry, broken and haunted, mistook this defiance for salvation. Anne had no children, no marriages, no dead sons in cradles. She was untouched by failure, a vessel unspoiled by tragedy. Henry began to see her as something more than a mistress. She was a promise, a cure. If he could cast off Catherine and take Anne, he could escape the curse. He could defy the verse, he could have another son. But to reach Anne, he would have to break the world. Still, the haunting did not stop. One evening, months after the prince's death, a guard at Richmond reported hearing a baby cry behind a sealed nursery door. When the door was opened, the room was empty save for the tiny toy lamb now resting in the center of the crib. No one had placed it there. No one had even entered. Henry refused to speak of the child again. When one courtier made the mistake of offering condolences, the king snapped, "I have no son." But his eyes, hollow and red-rimmed, betrayed the truth. He still saw that bloodied face in every flame, every shadow. He would never escape it, and so unable to undo the past, he decided to destroy it. Catherine would be cast aside, Mary would be pushed into the margins, the church would be broken, and all of it, every execution, every betrayal, every exile, would be justified by the death of a 52-day-old baby. A baby who had no idea how much blood would be spilled in his name. Catherine of Aragon did not die with her son, but part of her never lived again. Her grief hollowed her. The once confident queen who rode beside Henry in tournaments and charmed diplomats in 6 languages became a shell of fear and prayer. Her eyes lost their light. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She no longer walked with purpose, she drifted, moved as if underwater. She returned obsessively to the private chapel at the palace. There she lit candles every evening, always the same number, always in the same order. At first it seemed like simple devotion, but soon even the priests grew uneasy. One finally dared ask her what the pattern meant. She replied, "One for every beat his heart should have lived." The priest never asked again. She wore black long after the court insisted she move on. She kept the tiny white bonnet the prince had worn on the day of his christening tucked inside her bodice. It was said she often clutched it in the middle of court functions. fingers trembling as if she could still feel the warmth of his head beneath it. And worse, some claimed she spoke to it. Catherine's body, once hailed as regal and fertile, had become a tomb of despair. In the years following the death of her son, she suffered at least 3 more pregnancies. None survived. Some ended before the child had even quickened. Others were more horrific late-term losses that came with screams and blood that stained the palace floors. One baby born deformed and lifeless was reportedly never recorded in the royal logs. Each time she blamed herself. Her letters to family in Spain reveal a woman consumed by spiritual terror. She begged for relics from saints said to protect children. She fasted until her nails turned blue. She whispered to the Virgin Mary not for a child, but for forgiveness, as if some terrible sin lay in her womb, infecting every life it tried to create. Those around her began to wonder if she was cursed, or mad, or both. Henry's growing distance only worsened her descent. He stopped visiting her bed, stopped speaking to her in private, stopped even offering pretense at affection. When she wept during a court masque after the actors performed a play in which a queen is punished for her ambition, Henry reportedly rolled his eyes and walked away. To him, her grief had become an inconvenience, a bitter echo of a failure he was trying to forget. But Catherine could not forget. She became obsessive about protecting their only surviving child, Mary. The little girl was frail, pale, and heartbreakingly serious. She was not permitted to play with other children often. Catherine watched her constantly hovering, praying, blessing her every movement. She insisted on multiple physicians. She wept when Mary coughed. She wrote long, anxious treatises about her diet, her stool, her dreams. Mary would grow up smothered in that grief, and it would shape her like iron molds fire. Some claimed Catherine kept relics of her dead children hidden in her chambers. A tiny embroidered slipper, a lock of hair, a blood-stained cloth from the night her first son died. One dismissed maid later told of a hidden box beneath the queen's bed, sealed and heavy. She said it hummed with sorrow. No one ever opened it, and when asked about it, Catherine only said, "Some memories cannot be buried. They must be guarded." As whispers about Anne Boleyn began to swirl through the court, Catherine's horror deepened. She saw what was coming, the displacement, the annulment, the undoing of everything she had endured. But she would not yield. She believed God would defend her. She believed righteousness would preserve her crown. She was wrong. Henry began courting Anne openly with gifts, poems, even political favors. Catherine was forced to watch from a throne that now felt like an execution seat. Anne was everything she was not: young, fertile, unburdened. She did not carry ghosts. Not yet. One chilling moment recorded by a Spanish ambassador came during a court dinner. Catherine, seated beside Henry, remained quiet as he flirted openly with Anne across the hall. Suddenly, Catherine stood glass in hand and stared directly at Anne. Her voice, hoarse but unshaken, echoed across the room. "You will never birth a son. Not while my child's blood stains this kingdom." Silence fell. No one dared breathe. Henry's face turned white with fury. Anne reportedly smiled. After that, Catherine's chambers were relocated, her power diminished, her household cut. The Queen of England was being erased methodically, deliberately, and without remorse. She fought. She petitioned the Pope. She begged for Henry's heart. She knelt before him in public, but nothing moved him. The king who had once knelt for her was now a stranger in scarlet robes and gold-clutching prophecy instead of love. And still, Catherine clung to hope, to Mary, to the memory of a son who had died choking on his own blood in the dark. Even when her titles were stripped, even when she was banished from court, Catherine insisted she was queen. She would go to her grave with that belief. But she never escaped that nursery, not truly, because grief like hers doesn't end. It calcifies, it poisons, and it waits. A child died in 1511, and within a generation, England would drown in fire and blood. Henry VIII could not erase the image of his lifeless son, but he could make sure it never happened again. or so he believed. That belief, desperate, furious, and festering, set into motion the most violent transformation in English history. The quest for another son became an obsession that tore apart the very soul of the kingdom. When Anne Boleyn finally gave in to Henry's relentless pursuit, she did so with one promise hanging in the air like a sword: she would give him a male heir. She had to. The ghost of Henry, Duke of Cornwall, still haunted every corridor of the court. The weight of that dead baby's tiny coffin bore down on Anne's womb. And so the king began his campaign to rid himself of Catherine. It started with political pressure urging the Pope to annul the marriage. When that failed, Henry turned to theological gymnastics, leaning hard into Leviticus, declaring before Parliament and God that his union had always been cursed. The death of his son wasn't a tragedy, it was proof. Divine condemnation. Catherine refused to relent, and that defiance was enough for Henry to defy the entire Catholic Church. He broke from Rome. This wasn't just religious rebellion, it was state-mandated heresy. The monasteries were seized. The abbeys, some older than England itself, were looted and torn stone from stone. Monks were dragged into the streets, tortured, executed. Nuns who refused to leave were starved out. The countryside bled as centuries of faith were ripped from the ground. All of this, every swing of the axe, every scaffold that rose in London, every torch held to sacred wood, was rooted in the king's belief that he had to correct the mistake of his first marriage, to cleanse the curse, to finally earn a living son. But Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter, Elizabeth. And though history would remember her as a great queen at the time, she was a bitter disappointment. Another girl, another failure. The curse, it seemed, still lived. Anne's position became increasingly fragile. Her subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage and stillbirth. In 1536, she gave birth to a severely deformed fetus, an event so shrouded in secrecy and shame that details were scrubbed from many records. But the truth was too gruesome to hide. It was another boy, another heir, another corpse. Henry had had enough. He turned on Anne with the same cold fury he once reserved for the shadows in his dreams. She was arrested, accused of adultery and incest, and beheaded within weeks. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower Chapel. 2 queens, 2 sons, 2 graves. Still no living male heir. But there was one child left, Mary, the daughter of Catherine. She had been stripped of her title, declared illegitimate, cast aside like a ghost. But she remembered everything. The humiliation, the isolation, the grief of her mother who died in exile, poisoned by sorrow and, possibly whispers say, by the king himself. When Henry finally had a living son, Edward, by his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, the kingdom sighed with relief. The prince lived, but not for long. Edward VI, crowned at age 9, would become a ruler in name, only a sickly boy surrounded by vultures. He suffered chronic illness, pale, frail, often bedridden. Many said he resembled his dead half-brother. Some even claimed he looked like him. The same eyes, the same stillness, the same silence. He died at 15. By the time Mary ascended the throne, she was no longer the innocent child of Catherine's prayers. She was brittle, wounded, paranoid, and merciless. She remembered the cradle. She remembered the stripping of titles. She remembered watching her mother fade away like a ghost under torchlight, and she burned England for it. In her reign, hundreds of Protestants were executed, burned alive in public squares. Heretics, they were called. Traitors to the old faith. But many were simply victims of a queen trying to resurrect a lost world, trying to make her mother proud, trying maybe to finally avenge her brother. They called her Bloody Mary. And through it all, one truth remained whispered in the dark corridors of the tower. None of this would have happened if the first son had lived. If that baby had drawn a full breath, if his heart had lasted a year, England might have remained Catholic, peaceful, untorn by schism and fire. No Elizabeth, no Reformation, no Anne Boleyn, no martyrs screaming at the stake. Just one boy on a throne. But instead, a child died in the night, and history broke. Imagine a world where that tiny cry in the night had become a boy's laughter in the garden. a man's voice on the throne. If Henry, Duke of Cornwall, had lived, the Tudor dynasty would have looked very different. No Anne Boleyn, no Reformation, no rupture with Rome, no Bloody Mary, no Elizabeth the Virgin Queen. England would have remained Catholic, its churches unbroken, its abbeys standing tall. The Pope's authority would have endured. Thomas More might have lived. Thomas Cromwell might never have risen. Entire wars, generations of religious slaughter, centuries of political fracture, all of it might have been avoided by the breath of a baby. But that breath was stolen, and some believe it wasn't nature or illness that took it. There are theories, not just among historians, but among the ghost hunters and the occultists. They believe the Duke of Cornwall's death was a turning point so violent, so unnatural, it left a spiritual scar across the monarchy. Some say his ghost never left the palace. That in the older halls of Hampton Court, if you wander late enough and the wind is quiet, you can hear a child whimpering endlessly just out of sight. And then there's the nursery. It was sealed after his death, not touched again until long after Henry was buried. When workers were finally allowed inside, they found something that had no explanation. The wooden cradle burned black, charred as though by fire, but the room showed no signs of flame, no heat, no soot, only that crib scorched at the center like an offering. The stain remains, a reminder, a warning, because history did not just shift when that child died, it bled, and the throne of England has never been clean since. If this dark story haunted you as much as it haunts the pages of history, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more disturbing tales from the shadows of the past. Have you heard whispers of other royal tragedies lost to time? Leave a comment. We're always watching the darkness, and your voice just might unlock the next chilling story. Until next time, don't look away when the candles go out. Not everything that dies stays gone. Thanks for watching.